Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to this very special program on Humanity Rising between now and the next 5 days on strategies of resistance. Today is January 20th, 2025. In about 1 hour, Donald Trump will be sworn in as the next president of the United States. In the rotunda of the Capitol building, since it's below freezing, and the normal procedure of doing it at the back of the Capitol, facing the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument beyond that, where all the supporters can gather to cheer and adulate the new incoming presidential administration. That's all been called off. Everything's been now into the Capitol building, which is happening within, I'd say 150 meters of where I'm sitting here right now. I've been hearing the police helicopters. I ventured out earlier, and everything is just chain link fenced off. And so you can't get anywhere near the Capitol building of American democracy. It doesn't belong to the people today. It belongs to the police. And they've made that very, very clear. I want to make some opening comments about strategies of resistance in a time of Trump, which is much more complex than the personality of Trump. And I would note that if those of you recall the inauguration back on January 20th of 2017, I was here for that. I came back because there was, with extraordinary press and hullabaloo, the Women's March that was 500,000, upwards of 1 million people. I was there with some colleagues. It was very exciting, and we came into the inauguration full of resistance, very public way. Most people didn't even know that there was a protest on Saturday at the Washington Monument. Very little press attention. According to the reports by some people that were there was a couple hundred, maybe 300,000. The press reports all said it was closer to 30 to 50,000. The irony is that the more we've understood about who Trump really is, the less resistance is being organized against him. And I'd like to just offer some considerations as to why. I think to a large degree, the energy around Trump has been lessened because of the legacy of the Biden administration. The last 4 years of Joe Biden in the White House has been so catastrophically dysfunctional that I think people realize that, to focalize on Trump or the Republicans being the enemy, if you were a progressive, many of us came to realize that Biden was in many ways as bad, if not worse, than Trump, particularly given what he did by sanctioning and aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza. It's very interesting to note that we've now had a ceasefire. I'll comment on that more fully, but that didn't happen because of Joe Biden. It happened because of Donald Trump. Donald Trump made it clear he didn't want any war going on while he was inaugurated. And by the way, historically, that's what Barack Obama did. And the ceasefire back in 2009 happened on January 17th, as the Israelis were forced to stop what they called Operation Lead, which was the carpet bombing of Gaza, on orders by the incoming president. Trump has done it again. So this enemy formation, which is really important, the enemy formation is no longer clear. It's one thing to talk about strategies of resistance, another thing to talk about what and who are we resisting when resistance needs to be across the board. Second major factor, particularly in the United States, and I would say most countries around the world, is the increasing dysfunction of the prevailing civic institutions. Democracies are unraveling. Authoritarian regimes are on the ascendancy. Dysfunction reigns. So in a normal democracy, you can exercise people power through institutions. But what happens when the institutions are no longer responsible to the people? And thirdly, is the rise of social media and the inability of anybody now to discern where the truth is and what is the lie. So if there's no clear target for resistance, if there are no institutional mechanisms for resistance, if the truth is no longer available upon which to build resistance in a reliable way, how does one resist? And these are the complexities of our time. These are the challenges of people of goodwill. And these are the deep imponderables that we, over the next 5 days, are going to wrestle with as we seek to get clarity as to what is going on really, and where is the most effective acupuncture point to resist the growing tide of iniquity. So thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Humanity Rising. It's a wonderful, wonderful community to ponder these issues. It's extraordinary to have a community that's actually willing to ponder these deep imponderables. And as Socrates said, it's never about the answers. It's about the willingness to grapple with the questions. Because if you grapple deeply, your certainties vanish, and in their place, your soul is enlarged to be able to hold the contradictions and live a more authentic life. I'd like to now bring on and introduce my very good friend, Tom Eddington, who's been a partner in Humanity Rising. You all know him. He needs no introduction. So, Tom, with great joy and deep love, I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's terrific to be here today. And auspiciously, I'm joining you all from Washington, D.C. I've been here for a couple of weeks and will be here for a couple more. And I'd like to make a confession as we start today's broadcast and share a bit about not only this week, but next week. On the evening of and the morning after the election last November, I found myself in just in a horrible state of despair and disbelief, and felt outraged. I have been most of my career, and certainly the last better part of 20 years, I've been working with leaders and doing conscious leadership work and conscious leadership development. And character for me is essential to the work that I do. And I witnessed the American public making a choice that I just could not accept, I couldn't agree with. And I was outraged, and I immediately went to a place of what can I do about it? And so I reached out to Jim and said, I'd like to do a broadcast on Humanity Rising as a result of the election. And so we agreed to do the broadcast starting today on the day of the inauguration. And the second piece that was there for me was real despair around relationships. I have a number of colleagues and family members and friends who voted for President Trump. And I spent 6 or 7 months trying to understand in the run-up to the election why they were making the choice they were making. And so I reached out to Michael Nagler, dear friend, about doing this week on strategic resistance and ensuring that we use all of the tools of nonviolence. And then I reached out to my friend Eileen Barker about next week, because I was faced with, how do I forgive? How do I live from a place of forgiveness with my friends, my family, my colleagues who chose to vote for Trump? And so these next 2 weeks are very personal for me. And I just want to share that as a backdrop for this week and next. The way we framed this week is that there's a number of populations here in America that have been targeted. So tomorrow we'll be starting with discussions on immigration. Wednesday we'll move to non-gender conforming population. Thursday we'll focus on women's sovereignty, and Friday we'll focus on the environment. And so that's the format for this week. And with regard to today, before I bring Michael into our conversation, I'd just like to share a few opening comments. And first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that not only is today the inauguration, but it's also Martin Luther King Day. And as Heather Cox Richardson, in her writing today, Letters from an American, wrote about heroes, she wrote that on April 3rd, 1968, the night before the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a white supremacist, he gave a speech in support of sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. Since 1966, King had tried to broaden the civil rights movement for racial equality into a larger movement for economic justice. And I bring that into today's conversation because it's important for us to recognize, as Jennifer Rubin wrote in The Contrarian, of, for, and by the billionaires, now all of us will experience the consequences of electing an autocrat surrounded by a flock of flunkies who are all devoid of ethics, decency, empathy, and expertise, as Trump is. We did not simply elect an autocrat. We chose a nation to usher in an oligarchy, the likes of which we have not seen since the Gilded Age. And as anyone who's been following the news over the last several months, we know that 90 million Americans chose not to vote. 77 million voted for Trump, and 75 million voted for Kamala Harris. And so the vast majority of Americans have chosen to sit on the sidelines. And one of the messages from this week is about action. and it's time to have the American people recognize that the choice that was made at the voter booth in November is not representative of who we are as a nation, not representative of who we've been for 248 years of our national history. And we do have an opportunity. Trump has made it really clear. He was running to stay out of jail. Now that he has succeeded in accomplishing that, he has turned over the steering wheel to whoever can grab it and take control. And it's up to us as Americans to choose what do we want to become our nation's history over the next 4 years. So with those opening comments, I'm delighted to be here today, and I would like to invite my good friend and colleague, Michael Nagler, to join us and talk about strategic resistance and what do we do as a society.
Wow, thank you very much, Tom. Your introductions, the two of you, raised so many questions. I jotted down so many notes. I could just throw out everything I was planning to say, but I think I'll stick with it anyway. I did want people to know that in addition to the rather distressing event that's happening where you guys are today, it is an auspicious day in a couple of other ways. You mentioned one, Tom, that it is right around the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. It's also my birthday. And this is the worst birthday present I've ever had, except it's very good to be able to talk back to it. And along with that, we have just recently received copies of our new, let's see, I get this right, our new book, Looking for Light, which is very handsome, if I say so myself, and which consists of 108 quotes about nonviolence. So, with that introduction, let me get over to my talk. I suppose a lot of us are thinking and feeling what just happened. A commentator, journalist by the name of Tim Ryback in The Atlantic online last week had a very thoughtful study called How Hitler Dismantled a Democracy in 53 Days. And he quoted Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Nazi regime, saying, the big joke on democracy is that it gives its mortal enemies the means to its own destruction. This is probably a more cynical way of putting a generalization that I think is important for us. And that is that in a democratic regime, or as a regime in which we are supposed to have what Jim just called people power, everything depends on the quality of mind of the people. And that's what we keep forgetting. And that's what I've been concentrating on, what we've been concentrating on here at the Meta Center. That we feel that it is not necessary to change the political system, it's necessary to change the ingredients of that system. So, in other words, one of the problems that led to this disaster, to call it by its appropriate name, is that we were complacent about the concept of democracy. We thought, and I had a colleague who gave me a lot of trouble when I was doing peace and conflict studies at the University of California. He said, democracy, democracy, you're not big. So finally I said, John, what is democracy? He was stumped. He had fought his whole life, alienated all his colleagues, made himself thoroughly obnoxious, and gotten promoted by putting up this word democracy, and he really couldn't much define what it was. Finally, he kind of stammered out, one man, one vote. Well, I would describe this as the outer shell of democracy. And you have to peel it away and get down through 3 or 4 other shells. And you get to something that we call our political culture. How do we practice our values and institutionalize them, as Jim was saying? But we have to go even further, I believe. We have to peel even that away and get to the heart of the matter, which we very seldom do. We rarely think about it, but it's critical. And that is the image of the human being. Who do we think we are? And I'm going to spend a little time with you now showing, I think, the connections between this inbuilt, inherent, unquestioned image of who we think we and other people are and the really dismal political outcome of it. Now, Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Review of Literature, or as it became under his regime, the Saturday Review of Everything But Literature, informally, because politics overshadowed everything at that point. This is back in the 50s and 60s. But he pointed out that we have no agreed on definition of the human being today. But actually, I think the situation is a little bit worse than that. I'm hitting bottom now, almost hitting bottom. I got a couple of really nasty things to share with you, and then we bounce back up, so bear with me. G.K. Chesterton was once approached by someone who wanted to appear smart and said, "Isn't it awful, G.K., if people don't believe in God, they won't have anything to believe in?" And Chesterton said, "It's much worse than that. When they don't believe in God, they'll believe in anything." And in our case, what we believe in as a culture, without discussing it, is something called reductive materialism, where we think that everything is made up of physical particles and forces, when in fact scientists have told us that there really is no such thing. Everything is the interplay of forces, which, as Max Planck pointed out back in the beginning of quantum theory, are really responding to the ultimate power of consciousness. And that the human being in this universe of consciousness, energy, and matter, a descending pyramid, inverted triangle in that way, that we ourselves as a microcosm are consciousness or spirit, mind, and body. And the problem is that we have come to, functionally speaking, believe that we're only bodies with sensations. I'm going to recommend to you a documentary, a long documentary. It's worth every minute of it. Black and white, good old-fashioned style, made in the UK. It was called Century of the Self. And Culture of Narcissism is a book that came out in the 70s. This is really the core of our problem, that we think of ourselves as isolated from one another, from the rest of environment around us, and ultimately, because of that, there are isolations and chasms of separation within ourselves. Now, I know about doom scrolling and how bad that is, and I read a very good book that I'll share with you with the title of called Breakthrough, which shows that scare advertising, where they showed lots of pictures of car accidents, led to a lot more car accidents, because that's the suggestiveness of the human mind. And so it's a bad idea to dwell on the negative, but I think we need to take into account how bad things have become in this layer of the, the human person, which feeds into the culture, which feeds into the political system. So, and which is today in a polycrisis. And my reason for doing this, for getting down to what I think is the deepest level of the problem, is to provide possible avenues towards what I'd like to call a poly solution to the polycrisis. So these are two really distressing things that I have come across recently. Bear with me. I'm partly doing this to share grief with you because, as the old saying goes, grief shared is halved, or down to a much smaller fraction. In a case like this, joy shared is doubled. We'll get around to a little bit of that. But in the Atlantic, from the same issue that I quoted just a minute ago, there was an article called "The Army of God Comes Out of the Shadows," stating that tens of millions of American Christians are embracing what they call a charismatic movement. I know the Greek language. I taught Greek for when the honest part of my career, and charisma means grace. This is the charismatic in this sense is the exact opposite. But okay, that aside, tens of millions of Americans are embracing a movement known as the New Apostolic Reformation, which seeks to destroy the secular state. Now, this has happened before in history. In the third, fourth century of our era, there were some very extremist Christians called circumcellions that went around flagellating themselves. And when they got tired of flagellating themselves, they beat other people in order to compel them into the fold. And they were held up to, I wouldn't say ridicule, but the dangers and the absurdity and the unchristianity of it was brought to light by St. Augustine, mainly in the City of God. Now, we don't have an Augustine right now to point out that these tens of millions of people are running around bringing the image of humanity down to the lowest level and poisoning the environment. The second thing that I want to point out is much less drastic, but it also, again, helpful as a possible way back out. And that is from a book by a young friend of mine called Nathan Schneider. The book was called, this is what ex-professors do, by the way. They constantly talk about books. Hope you don't mind. At least I've thrown in a film. But Nathan Schneider created a book called Everything for Everyone about the history of cooperatives, which completely undercut the separatist, materialist basis of the culture that's given us this difficulty. And he lists a very large number of cooperatives that exist right now in the United States. Some of them are agricultural, some of them are manufacturing, like Co-op Sinti. We interviewed them recently on the Meta Center's radio program, Nonviolence Radio. And I just want to quote one little snippet from that book to point something up. And this is a quote, "A fair trade spice distributor and a worker-owned mental health center have offices next door to each other in my town, but they have never talked with each other about being co-ops." This made me think of a book that came out about 15 years ago now, had raised up the concept of cultural creatives. This book pointed out that the majority of persons, I'm making this a very big generalization, there of course are regional differences. It's a lot more like this here in California. The majority of people are what they call cultural creatives, which are open-minded, who favor peace and could, if they heard about it, be inspired to study nonviolence. They actually are a majority, but the problem is they don't talk to each other. So as my friend Mel Duncan, who started Nonviolent Peace Force, liked to say, the ingredients abound. We have all we need to bring together an entirely new culture, which would be human-based and future-oriented. But something is missing, and that is, I think, our awareness. We just aren't aware, and we find it difficult to be made aware of this enormous positive potential, which can never be eliminated in the human being or potentially in the societies and the political structures that they build. And that is the potential of wisdom and love. So what we desperately need is a framework which would make these connections and these among these movements obvious and would bring to the surface the common principle that each of them is expressing. Then we could really birth that principle. It would mobilize a lot of energy that we didn't know was there. I keep thinking of how Mahatma Gandhi made this work so well with one symbol, the charkha, which was the spinning wheel, which was a symbol of a kind of economic life which is not unlike what Nathan Schneider described and what other authors described in cultural creatives, that enables the human being to express his or her capacity to overcome poverty and destitution and the dependency that arises from it. So with that rather rambling introduction, thank you for bearing with me, I want to do two things. I want to define the terms that Jim has given us, strategic resistance. From my point of view as a nonviolent scholar, strategic to us is part of a dyad of two terms, strategic and principled. We speak of strategic nonviolence and principled nonviolence. What that means is that people can, without too much acculturation, without too much influencing, without too much re-educating them, they can participate in what they call strategic nonviolence, meaning, for example, we are going to withdraw our cooperation from the system, make it impossible to operate, period. Versus principled nonviolence, where, see, in strategic nonviolence, very often, you carry that out, which is mostly negative, mostly a withdrawal. You carry it out as a strategy toward a particular goal. When the goal is reached or fails to be reached, the campaign is over. But strategic nonviolence is very much less important and less potent and less of an underlying principle of reality than what we call principled nonviolence, which means I am going to act nonviolently because I believe it's right and I don't care what you're going to do to me, and I pretty much don't care about the results. Though, of course, I will feedback if I succeeded and failed. I'll make adjustments. But nonviolence for me, and this, as you may have guessed, this is my position. Nonviolence for me is a profound principle that operates everywhere. Now, that was the first thing that I wanted to, half of the first thing I wanted to talk about with you, how strategic for me brings up its older and wiser brother of principle resistance. The second thing, and Jim is absolutely right, resistance is the mode that we are going to have to organize for and get involved in a way that has rarely been seen in American history. But resistance is only, as it were, maybe the most dramatic, but not the most critical or important way to employ or deploy nonviolent power. What's more long-lasting and deeper in its implications about who we are and what we could become is constructive action. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail when I get around to sharing with you our model of the roadmap. Now, the second thing out of several that I wanted to share with you is that what we're up against with this electoral dysfunction is that people are operating, or in this case, voting, from what you might call instinctual energies, gut feelings, button pushing, that are far below and more powerful than, many times, the capacities to reason. And the shallowness of the rationalizations that voters give for voting for Trump are a dead giveaway that that's not really why they're voting for him. So, for example, there is a mechanic somewhere, I believe, in the Midwest who said, well, both parties are lying, but at least Trump is open about it. And that reminded me of a conversation I had with a woman years ago who was voting for Nixon. And I said to her, you really like Nixon? You'd think he'd be a good president? And she said, are you kidding? He's a thief. I said, oh, all right, then why are you voting for him? And she said, you wouldn't vote for Kennedy, would you? That was kind of the end of our conversation and almost the end of my vacation in Italy, which is very disconcerting. But what I'm trying to bring out is that people are, in their voting behavior, they are not being rational. What then are they being? Well, they are responding to unconscious manipulation. Think about it. Every single photograph or video of the incoming president that we have seen shows him scowling. What is he doing? He is very deliberate and very conscious and very successful in what he's doing. What he's doing is frightening us. Vote for me or else. So this is the level of gut response that I think most people are operating from, because really they would not be able to justify that vote very well on the rational level. So what we're dealing with is a decline of truth, as I think it was you, Tom, who mentioned earlier. And when truth recedes, various kinds of untruth come to the fore. And let's remember that for Gandhi, nonviolence was the second most important thing in the world, in the universe. It was a close second to truth. Nonviolence is an expression of truth. And the implementation of nonviolence would bring us toward truth. We have kind of a pincer potential here, opportunity. By building truth, we will unconsciously, not explicitly, create a more nonviolent world. And by using nonviolence, which is growing tremendously, by the way, all over the world, exponential growth in nonviolence has characterized the last 15 or 20 years, we would also tend to draw upon the power of and manifest the power of truth. So we know that Trump is manipulating us unconsciously, and that he's mainly manipulating is our fear. And that gives us two possible approaches. And they're not necessarily exclusive. And I'm not going to have the time to spell out in detail how they would work, but I think these are important operating principles. The more we could get people to use their reason, which is really hard, and I'm going to say why in a second, is the more they will be not any longer vulnerable to that kind of manipulation. The reason that it's so difficult to get people to use their reason, pardon the pleonasm, I think that's called, but why people can't use their reason anymore, why they have fallen out of the habit, is because of the overwhelming influence of advertising. And this is why I made reference earlier to that film called Century of the Self. Let me just share with you at this point one little vignette from that film. It showed an advertisement, cinematic advertisement for Ford cars back in the earliest days of the Model A. And that advertisement was a list of facts about the car. It goes this far on this much gas, it costs that, it's comfortable, it's uncomfortable. That was advertising in its earliest incarnation. Juxtaposed with that was an advertisement for an automobile of some kind in the 1950s. Much sleeker machine, of course. But the point was that the ad was built on a young couple buying their first car. And I'm going to try not to be explicit here, but get the point across. The wife slides in behind the steering wheel of this car in a very suggestive way and fondles it in a suggestive way and winks at her husband, sort of say, yes, let's buy it. Why I'm putting us through this? Because what they were doing, and this was made explicit in the literature of advertising, which incidentally was exactly the same technique that Goebbels was developing in Nazi Germany, was this appealing to negative drives instead of reason, which became very, very widespread to the extent that we can't escape it. So there is a profound connection between the ubiquity, sorry, Jim, the ubiquity of advertising in our culture, the way it has become part of our way of viewing the world, along with that reduction of the human image to where we think that we are only consumers of material things. So we can do one of two things. We can get people to use their reason, help them elevate their awareness above the miasma of political and commercial advertising, and or we can manipulate feelings the way the Trumpists do, but in reverse. Instead of manipulating fear, we can inspire people to have courage. Again, I hope you'll excuse me. I'm not going to give you any concrete examples of this today, but I just want to lay that out as general guidelines. So in the long term, I think we need a multi-pronged strategy. And this is in no particular order here. I'm going to share these with you. One thing we need to do is we absolutely must infiltrate our educational systems and that most powerful infrastructure of our formal educational systems, known as the media. We must infiltrate those systems with the truth. And that is why our good friend Joanna Macy developed something that she called the new story, a new narrative of what a human being is. And we have a great advantage to do this, which I don't think people are generally aware of or not using. And that is that it's building beautifully in science. Science, after all, is, as my late friend Willis Harman used to say, it's the knowledge validating system of our civilization. If a thing is disproven by science, it's not true, especially if your reason is functioning. And in the last, about 40 years, science has shifted its outlook from the kind of Freudian, pseudo-Darwinian image of all nature as red in tooth and claw, and all human interaction is fundamentally competitive. They have shifted their outlook on the physical world as a set of material particles randomly banging into each other, to the absolutely glorious, though mostly incomprehensible, mysterious, miraculous discoveries of quantum physics. And these scientific findings are slowly leaking into the mainstream of how we view the world. And that's something that I think we can facilitate. I'll just share with you, here I will share with you one concrete example. We know that our ancestors, named by ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, super smart hominins, coexisted with Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis, for something like 40,000 years, and interbred to a slight extent. For example, most of us have about 4 or 5% Neanderthal DNA. My son-in-law says he has 7%. I think he's just boasting. But one of the big mystery about these Neanderthals was why 40,000 years ago, after they had lived on this planet for almost 100,000 years, why they went extinct. And scientists have recently hit upon why that may have been. It's very, very interesting. The one thing that was different about Neanderthals and us, our ancestors, is not so much the physical stature or the eyebrow ridge. It turns out not to be the use of tools, the creation of art. Neanderthals had all those things. But the one thing they didn't have was networking. You'd have a small, isolated clump of Neanderthals in one area, sharing one cave, another not too, maybe just a week's walk away, and there would be apparently no connection between them. They didn't spread the innovations in tool use. They didn't spread their DNA very much, whereas we're hominins, Homo sapiens sapiens, or our earliest versions thereof, were extremely interactive and networking. And that apparently is why our ancestors were much more successful in the terms of evolution and Neanderthals passed. So what I would like to do now, thank you for bearing with me. This has been longer than I thought it would be, but I'd like to share with you a model that we've developed at the Meta Center called the roadmap. And I think I can even manage the technology. Yeah, there. So roadmap is a model because this is a complex situation that we're facing, but it has an underlying basis, which is fundamentally not very complex. And that is the recognition that we are body, mind, and spirit. And that's critically important because as bodies, we are separate. As minds, we're somewhat in connection. And as spirit, otherwise known as consciousness, there are no limitations at all. We are now exploring our interconnectedness on the mind level, but also sharing to the extent that we are on the same wavelength and drawing perhaps a little bit of inspiration together. We are literally breathing together. That's what inspiration means. And we are forging a connection at a much, much deeper and more long-lasting level. But anyway, this model enables us, I think, to operate more effectively in the long run. So you will see that the roadmap has 3 circles. Jim talked about people power, which is a very, very prominent aspect of nonviolence, the power that people can generate when they get together in large numbers. Underneath that was the fundamental units of all of those corporate organisms, groups of people, and that is person power. What is the power resident within the individual person? And I spelled out a couple of things to think about there, which I'll get back to. But the general idea of roadmap is that it is a centrifugal model. We want to think first and foremost about developing our own power. Then we need to think about how to build the world that we want based on the power that we have developed and recognized and developed within ourselves. And this is the part that is usually overlooked in movements, whether it's just a spontaneous demonstration or even a lot of peace movement organizations. They overlook the power to create what we want. It's much less confrontational, much less abrasive, and builds a wonderful, firm infrastructure on which we can then do the strategic resistance, thank you, Jim, that is necessary for overturning the remaining islands of injustice that we still have not made irrelevant by our constructive program. So how do we develop person power then? We have 5 recommendations. The first is to cultivate healthy media habits. I have just made a vow this morning that I'm not even going to read the news on my phone before I come to work. It was getting me too depressed. Because, it isn't really news. It's the break, as Gandhi said, we don't study history. We study the breakdowns of history and call that history. So by cultivating healthy media habits, it basically means you're going to stop a lot of scrolling. And that means we're going to have some time on our hands. What on earth should we do with it? Go bowling? Well, we could. But we strongly recommend at Meta that you learn everything you can about nonviolence. Nonviolence has a profound theory based in the fundamental re-evaluation and new understanding of what a human being is. It has an extensive history. There at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, there is a database called the Global Nonviolent Action Database, GNAD. In the field, we just call it GNAD. And it lists over 1,200 episodes of nonviolent action, most of it strategic nonviolence, that has taken place in recent history. To some extent, in earlier history, where that can be recovered. People didn't think to look at it, so look for it. So they didn't record it very well. It doesn't mean you have to memorize all 1,400 episodes, but it would be wonderful, for example, to visit GNAD and take a look at their categories, women's movements, insurrectionary movements, and so forth, and get a sense of how widespread this thing is. Another resource, if I may share with you, is, of course, the metacenter.org. We have a wonderful film, thank you, Tom, called The Third Harmony, and a number of resources and courses. We are almost always doing courses, one coming up soon. So let's re-educate ourselves by way of infiltrating our educational system about nonviolence, which has had a really stellar history and created a lot of good in this world. Then we also recommend, and that's the point of this kind of yogic person in the person power circle here, we recommend that even if you stop watching mass media, which is a very good idea, and start coming to the Meta Center and Ubiquity University, which is even better ideas, there will be a deep residue of negative propaganda that we have all unconsciously absorbed. And the way to overcome it is through meditation or some kind of spiritual practice where we not only put new content into the mind, but change the actual framework or structure of the mind. I won't say more about that because this is kind of a personal choice that people have to make, but I do believe that it's essential to give us our greatest capacity. And once, of course, we're doing all these three things, we're going to turn into pretty nice people. So then I recommend that we deliberately make an effort to personalize our relationships and to overcome the virtualization of the world. I was coming across the Bay Bridge one time. A friend of mine was driving and we stopped to pay the toll. And, we had to get somewhere. And he gets into this conversation with the lady at the toll booth. He says, are you getting toward the end of your shift? How long have you been at this work? Where do you live? And I was fuming. I was saying, Jim, for God's sakes, get us out of here. And then I suddenly realized I was wrong and he was right. Just to hand people some money and flash on by was to depersonalize and dehumanize to that slight degree. And wherever possible, we should be trying to do the exact opposite. So now you're really well poised to take action. So what we recommend is that you assess what are my strengths and weaknesses, where can I be most effective, and where does the world need me most, and get up and doing. Now, we don't say that you have to be illumined before you to undertake constructive program and so forth, but we do say that limitations that remain in our personality will be a kind of limiting factor on how effectively we can do constructive program and then undertake resistance. If you go to our website and look up roadmap, you'll find a more filled in version of this where there are different examples of all of these categories with new story creation at the top. So I think I may have overstayed my welcome. I will I will stop here, and I look forward very much to any ensuing discussion that we want to share.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That was a wonderful way to help us frame the week and to get into the kinds of conversations that we want to be having. For me, being here in Washington, I walk out of the place I'm staying in, and there's a mural on the wall of John Lewis,
Mm,
and the mural just has some of his writings, and in very bold print on the wall, it says, "Getting in trouble, good trouble, and help redeem the soul of America." And it has an image of him and some raised fist as part of the mural. And I love the roadmap, and the importance of doing our personal work and being very thoughtful about the programmatic things, and then also the strategic resistance. And so, particularly, for the populations that have been targeted by the incoming administration,
mhm,
my heart goes out to each of the populations, and knows that the policies that the administration is embracing, when they're not achieved, the results that they've intended, they'll be just identifying additional populations to go after, as to make them wrong and to make them responsible for the lack of success. And so, I'm just wondering what, for you, when you think about the challenge that John Lewis has given us of redeeming the soul of America,
mhm.
and in the state of, or in the reality of what we're up against, and much of what you're describing is going to take time.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious what your thoughts are, and what are some immediate things. We can't just go to the cushion.
No. Well, that's a hard question for me, Tom, which I never have really successfully answered for myself. I cannot come up with a quick fix.
Hmm.
I wish I could, but I do think that if we go for the long, deep fix, it will help to manifest quick fixes at the appropriate time. I think what's very likely to happen is that the assault on one of those targeted groups, and I'm trying to remember who was the theologian in Germany. Probably all remember who said, they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't resist. Then they came for the Jews, but I wasn't Jewish, they didn't resist. And they came for me, and there was nobody left to
Hmm.
defend me. So this struggle to elevate and protect these vulnerable communities is not is not entirely self is not entirely unselfish. Our own protection is very much embedded in the protection of others. It's always been that way. Uh, but I think that some kind of uh, assault on our dignity will happen, and inevitably the people in power will go too far. They will cross a line. Even though they have beaten us down and made us cowering and afraid and feeling helpless and unworthy, at some point, the human spirit is going to rise up and say, no, I can't take this. There's a sociologist named Ted Gurr who says that there is a qualitative difference between poverty and destitution. In poverty, you don't lead a very good life, but you stay alive. In destitution, you can't feed your family or stay alive. And when that line is crossed, people rise up. That's simply history. What we have to do is prepare a conceptual and institutional infrastructure. So when those resistances happen, they don't just peter out with the conclusion of the issue, but they build to a more robust and more sustainable way of living. And there are ways to do this. The whole field of nonviolence is getting much more articulate and much more vocal. There is our mutual friend Rivera's son has appointed me a couple of days ago to a manual that lists, 40 or 50 things that we can do right in the face of this very emergency that we're facing. So to actually answer your question, Tom, I'm a little bit embarrassed here. I think the issue will present itself. Something will present itself where we feel we have to resist. And the more we prepare ourselves by learning and by networking, the better and more substantially and long term we will be able to respond. We may even reach a point where we can pick the issue. And this is, for example, the strategy that's employed by one of my favorite institutions, Nonviolent Peace Force, which now has 200 trained people who go around intervening in hot conflicts around the world, saving lives, like Sudan and like Ukraine. What they do is they choose an issue where they can succeed,
Mhm.
and then explain what they did, because most nonviolence happens and then just disappears. Explain what they did and build on that. Go from there. So I think that should be our overall strategy too.
Yeah, I think where I'm challenged, and you spoke to it a bit, is that we have a poly crisis. Humanity is facing the most extraordinary storm that we've ever faced as a species. We're also facing a series of meta crises where our compass for navigating not only the storm but the meta crisis, our compass is broken,
Yeah.
and we've got a meaning crisis.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
we've ushered in a leadership in Washington, D.C. that isn't even willing to acknowledge the poly crisis.
Yeah.
It has no intention of dealing with a broken compass to deal with the meta crisis, and has essentially left it up to the individual to
Yeah.
deal with their own meaning crisis,
Yeah.
and has offered a solution of just go make money. That's the material acquisition. That's the answer to your meaning crisis.
And material acquisition implies that you are a material being. You can
Mm.
be satisfied by material acquisition. And that's why I say it all ties back to building up a deeper awareness of who we really are. I'm remembering that it was 20, 2002, I think there was a very severe tsunami that hit the east coast of India and Sri Lanka. There was a U.S. Marine who was posted in a particular spot whose job was to hand out blankets and food all day. And some journalist asked him at the end of the day, I mean, how do you feel about doing this? This is not what you're trained for. And he said, this is a direct quote, I have been serving my country for 34 years, and this is the first day that I got any satisfaction out of it.
Mm.
Now, what we need to do is develop you talked about a compass. I think we need to develop the focusing instrument to grab onto that and recognize that this is the key to rebuilding human society, that you give people meaningful work that can engage their full being in service of others. Because as spirit or consciousness, we are not in the slightest way separate in time or space. So to build up that image, uh, I think is the kind of conceptual underpinning
Mhm.
of all the institutional and other changes that we want to bring about. To go back to what I started to say about democracy, the voting part of it is just a shell. I mean, the underlying assumption that gives democracy meaning is that every person has value.
Yeah.
Each person has value. Without that, why should you give them the vote? And that's why it was so absolutely critical for women, for example, to get suffrage. So I think being conscious, being articulate about that infrastructure, it has another advantage I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that it's a stealth mechanism. You know, if they say, we're going to wreck the environment, and we say, hell no, we're going to get in your face and stop you from doing it, that's very confrontational, which has a place, God
Mm.
knows. But if we are rebuilding the human image to the extent that they have an inkling that they are part of that nature, we won't have to fight them. So we can get a lot of attraction on the issue that way.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that.
I will try to answer more briefly. The questions are so good, I can't help.
Yeah, I'd like to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. And it's a horrible example of what we do, or a good example of what we don't want to see. But you know, the incident with Luigi Mangione
Mhm.
and the killing of the CEO of United Healthcare. Um, and you know, I look at that as a possibility of where all of this could go,
Mhm.
if people are misguided, if they're not careful, if we're not careful as a society.
Mhm. You're absolutely right, Tom. I've written an op-ed on that very point, which hasn't been published yet. Um, and when the civil rights move, well, long before the civil rights movement we're familiar with, but when their struggles started to manifest themselves, um, there was the raid on Harper's Ferry. Uh, what was his name again? The guy who,
Um, I'm losing it as well.
yeah. Okay, it will come back to me at some point and it'll be very amusing. But people were saying that if you didn't solve this problem nonviolently, it would get us
John Brown, someone just put in the chat.
John Brown.
Thank you,
Thank
Catherine.
you. Yeah. Yeah. The rest of it will also has to yet come back. Oh, I remember now. In the uh, in the colonial era, there was a very lovable, brave Quaker named John Woolman, and he took up the issue of slavery with a great deal of passion and walked all through the South, making himself getting into really good trouble. And someone coined the phrase, ignore John Woolman in one century and you'll have John Brown in the next.
Hmm.
That's what I was trying to remember. So, yeah, these problems, if they don't get solved nonviolently, they're going to get solved violently. And then they'll just remain in feedback. It's a feedback loop because the underlying principle of all these problems is violence. So to use violence to solve them only feeds back into the cycle. Hence the critical importance of developing nonviolent awareness and getting into the practice of using it.
Well, as we bring Jim back into the conversation, I just want to close with a quote and a question. In that 68 speech that Dr. King gave in Memphis, he says that, but I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars.
Yeah.
And so I would just ask you, Michael, how dark is it right now?
Oof.
How much darker will it need to get before we can see the stars?
Wow, I have been asking myself exactly that question. You know, how much worse will it have to be before people wake up and do the restoration? Concretely, I don't know the answer. It's been dark enough for me for about 50 years now. I think we're getting pretty close, and uh, the issue really is how quickly can we respond? And there, you know, our contribution has been if they have something to respond with and to build for, they will be more willing to respond and it'll happen sooner. So much has been damaged already, and I'm not sure that we can really stand much more, but I don't have the kind of insight to be able to predict. Everything that I predicted about my fellow human beings in the last 50 years has turned out to be wrong. I say, surely they won't do that, and then they would do it. So don't look to me for a concrete answer there.
Well, I'm looking to the chat. In the chat, there's an overwhelming response of we are the stars, each of us.
Yeah, that for sure. Yeah.
And we just need to shine our light.
Yeah. Hello, Jim.
Jim,
You're
your device on mute.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tom. Just so everybody's taking it in while Michael was talking, Trump has been sworn into the office about 17 minutes ago, and he's right now in the middle of his second inaugural address. And so this synchronicity between your remarks and Trump's remarks, Michael, is very poignant. And I'm almost thinking that we should probably take a break and adjourn to the after chat, so we can have a more interactive dialogue with all the people, because this is an issue that I think affects everybody in a very poignant way. I think the one closing comment that I would make is that I think I'm less and less persuaded that the problem is Trump. I think that was clear in 2016. But in the subsequent 8 years, in my perception, the issues have become so complex that more and more I'm seeing Trump as an effect, not a cause. And that puts the onus on us, because no one is doing this to us. We're doing it to ourselves. And we're doing it with full consciousness and full awareness. The American people knew who Trump was much more deeply in 2024 than they did in 2016. And he won by a bigger majority. So there's some questioning that we as Americans and we as humans, I would say, on this planet at this time, need to ponder much more deeply than we've ever pondered. And just to make one point about the global nature of this, in the face of the extreme weather events that are laying waste all over the world, there's not a single government in the world anywhere that's doing anything significantly about climate change. So we've got a problem, Houston, at levels that I don't believe we've really taken in, because we're used to blaming it on the white supremacists, or blaming it on Hitler, or blaming it on X, and blaming it on Y. But I think the reality of our time, which explains why we're teetering on the brink of self-destruction, has now become a systemic, I would say, ontological human issue, having most fundamentally to do with the human psyche, that even reliance on reason is not going to dispel. So I hope, gentlemen, over the next couple of days, we can ponder this more deeply. I don't think we should go into a discussion on it right now, but I wanted to leave us today with a deeper question, because I don't think any of us are anywhere near where we need to be in order to put together the critical mass of inquiry that would create a pathway that would lead out of the morass that's about ready to consume us. And I know this is a serious note with which to close, but in light of who's now president, not only of the United States, but countries whose president all over the world, we have a deeper problem than I think any of us can imagine. And we need to ponder it. So I hope, Tom and Michael and everyone, we can really open our hearts to the vulnerability of this moment, and really grapple over the next 2 weeks, as Tom said, strategies of resistance this week, and then forgiveness in a time of duress next week, so that we come through this as a rite of passage as opposed to a series of sessions. So in that spirit, Tom, why don't you just tee us up for what we're going to have tomorrow, and then we'll adjourn to the after chat.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the perspective you brought to the conversation today. And Michael, huge thank you for helping organize this week and bringing so much of your wisdom and perspective to today's conversation. Tomorrow, as I said, we will be focusing on immigration, but I'm delighted that we're joined by the executive director of an organization in California focused on Latinas' reproductive rights, and she brings a dimensionality to the perspective that goes beyond just reproductive rights and the Latina population. She brings a perspective around immigration, around the bigger picture, the bigger challenges, the systemic problems that we're facing as a country. And I'm delighted to have her with us tomorrow to continue this conversation. And Jim, to your comment about, this is bigger than Trump, I couldn't agree more. And as I was walking around the Capitol on Saturday, I walked over to the Supreme Court. And as I was standing out in front of the building, reading above equal justice under law, and I was surrounded by New York City police on bicycles that were there for the inauguration today, I spontaneously broke into tears as I was looking at the Supreme Court building and realizing the depth of the problem that we're faced with. All of our systems are in a state that will not allow us to be the stars that each of us are, that Dr. King referenced in his speech. And it's an opportunity we have to shine.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael. This brings our session to a close, everyone. This is the first of 5 sessions on strategies of resistance. You can join Tom and Michael in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you receive the link for the after chat in your Zoom reminders for today. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.